I would like to talk about a very fundamental concept that always applies when we are talking about human behavior, human nature, human development. And that is cognitively reflecting about ideas, concepts, attitudes is really only one side of it all. It is the superficial layer. It's the cognitive rational layer. It's expressing certain parts of reality in words and thoughts. And that's valid and it's important. But the danger here is to confuse talking with change. What informs most of our behaviors is the emotional layer, is our reactions. And these reactions almost never change just because someone explains something to you. Can happen if that piece of information that you're receiving is truly groundbreakingly, fundamentally new to you. It's possible that that results in such a fundamental shift in perspective that it does change a behavior. But that is not the standard normal way. And there I do see the weakness of all these trainings and strategies and information campaigns and awareness campaigns in telling us things that we kind of know. Then the underlying message is, okay, there is a desired behavior and then there is an undesired behavior, and well, now do better, now you know. And it is important to make certain statements fundamentally once and for all and say, okay, this is a behavior that is probably more constructive and functional, and there are different behaviors which are not. Also with legal implications, certain behaviors are not accepted in a legal sense or in the work context or whatever. These things have to be articulated. There's nothing wrong about that. The problem starts when people assume that that would lead to any significant shift in behavior. It does to some degree, and then that is being celebrated by research as, oh, the training has an impact. And I don't want to make it small if there are smart and effective strategies and they seem to work. And if you have evidence for that, well, congratulations. And I mean it. So that's a good thing in a way. But the trap is to assume that just because you explain something to someone, their behaviors can change. And of course, here we have to differentiate, like, what kind of behaviors are we referring to? If it is a part of your behavior that is completely rationally driven, like, for example, the way you write your emails, and somebody says to you, you know what, we do it like this. There is always this line in the beginning, and our standard is there's that line at the bottom. You probably don't face a lot of emotional resistance to implementing the change. It's mostly something where there's not many emotional mountains to move in order to change behavior. It's just a process. It's just okay, this is how we do it. I mean, you might meet resistance there if somebody is very emotionally connected to the way they write their emails. But for the sake of the example, these are changes in behaviors that we can do just because we are being told. But then there are many examples in life where it is not that easy. It doesn't work this way. And I think it is, I don't want to say it's cynical, because that would assume that people would kind of know that it doesn't work. They still apply the approach. And then if it doesn't work in the end, well, you're the one to blame. That would be the cynical approach. But I don't think that most people are cynical. They're just lacking the experience in how to actually get to the emotional level because they don't have the techniques for that. So it is not on their radar. They just have explaining and, well, there's the story, empathize with the other side. And then that's supposed to be enough for an actual transition in the way you experience the world emotionally. I mean, it gives you information, and on the cognitive layer, when you're being told in a gender training, this and that causes that and that emotion in the other person. It's not acceptable here. There's the line. If you do this, then you step over the line. Or, you're being told examples typically about what behavior is where on the scale from acceptable to maybe there's some kind of line or gray zone, which you also should already avoid. And then there is clearly stepping over the line, right? So you're getting this information. You're asked to empathize with it, which most people are able to. And then as a result, there should be a change in behavior. So the misunderstanding that I see in the conversations from very smart people who are working in the field, academics who really have a lot of very smart ideas and a great grasp about the concepts and the dimensions and the dynamics of the problem, which I respect a lot. They can articulate things sometimes better than me because they do have these concepts very clear. And I listen to that with a lot of curiosity. But the gap and the problem is, in my opinion, for example, there is still, in the last decades, there has always been this back and forth if sexual misconduct is primarily power or is it primarily sexual in nature. What's the driving force? And from what I know, there was, for a long time, a huge resistance to declare it, well, it is sexual, because, and here I'm now voicing an opinion because I do not know all the dynamics of the reasons, but it seems to me that the reason for that was to disconnect behavior from something instinctive or maybe natural in human or masculine nature, so that there could be responsibility and accountability. Because if one would say, well, this is how men are, it's their nature, that could be used as a cheap excuse, right? Well, this is just how we are. Of course, this is nonsense, right? But in order to say, hey, well, it's not sexual, it is power, one could focus on power structures and attempt to change things. And I understand the strategy, but it's not the truth. The truth is, in my opinion, that it is both. There is the aspect of power in situations where there is a power difference between two people. There is a higher probability and opportunity to manifest things that come from a place of desire. That can be the joy of controlling someone. That can just be already something that someone likes to do. And it can manifest itself in acting out behaviors that have a sexual dimension. But it goes together. There is the sexual aspect in there. Just to say it's only power, it misses the point. The power dynamics are very important, and they massively increase the risk that misconduct happens, be it sexual or otherwise, but there is still that aspect. So I would like to establish this. And why is that so important? It is so important because most trainings and interventions in organizations aim at the external factors. And it's right that they do, but they are missing the internal factors. Let's talk about the external factors. Power dynamics, there are mechanisms for reporting, there are consequences, right? Like if you have an aptitude to stealing, for example, right? And you just can't help it. Sometimes you feel you have to take something from a shop without paying. Let's just assume that for the sake of an example. And then if there are all cameras all over, you might not feel, all right, this is maybe not the moment. Or if you see the shop detective lurking around and you feel observed, and there's a high level of consequences, then it will be much less likely than you act this out. On the other hand, if you are in an environment where you see, oh, there's no camera, there seems to be nobody, this is an easy target. It's an environment that favors that behavior. You're more likely then to give in to that aptitude if you have it. I mean, it's human nature. It's very simple, right? And that's why it's important that organizations establish mechanisms which are effective, which are visible, which are practiced in a way to create an external environment that minimizes the possibility for unpunished misconduct and is acting preventively. I'm totally with that. And I'm no expert in how to craft these systems, because I think there are people who do that quite well and are very smart about this. I have not much a contribution there. But what they're missing is everything that happens inside. Fundamentally, it is about accepting the sex drive as a drive that humans have that influences behavior. In how far that happens, there is a spectrum among human beings. In some human beings, it's rather weak, in other, it's rather strong, and then there's everything in the middle. So you have that spectrum. And that's also a reason why so many people say, like, oh my God, I can never imagine that yeah, all right, okay, if you don't experience this drive so strongly, well, then, I mean, good for you, but then it's easy to say that. But it misses the point. So that is there. And one thing that is special about the sex drive in humans is that it can be connected to very different kind of other emotions. So in itself, it's just a drive, but it can be connected with other frameworks which are emotional or cognitive. And to give an example, there could be arousal, sexual arousal being experienced when there's a specific situation, like, for example, if there is a power dynamic where someone experiences, I'm more in charge, and then that creates an arousal and contributes to manifesting the sex drive in that context. Someone can be different. And when I say can be different, of course, there's a dimension that there's a development, how it comes to that. And people can be very different there. It could be the other way around, that someone really gets absolutely not aroused when there's such a power dynamic. And that is opening the door to an idea which I do not hear when there is this conversation about training and sexual misconduct, etc. How can men achieve an inner state, not a mental, cognitive state and an attitude and ideas and all that stuff, which just floats around and comes and goes, but an actual emotional response to the world that they don't act in a way that is destructive. And not with the main purpose of not being destructive, but all primarily for themselves, because it's just nicer, it's richer. I mean, of course, I cannot make that decision for other people if that's better for them or not. But that looks at things very differently. And what we then need in order to establish that or implement that in some kind of structure of a training is techniques in order to change the emotional response, to change what creates arousal. Because then you solve the problem. Because if you don't take care of that, the external factors, accountability, control mechanisms, the cognitive and rational trainings that you apply, the information, the don't do that things, will always push against internal mechanisms, and they will win a lot, but not always. And once these external mechanisms weaken, because the circumstances change, the organization doesn't have so many resources anymore, not so much attention, the person is in a context where these mechanisms are just failing, like in humanitarian organizations, in some refugee camp, where there are not as many mechanisms in place, or whichever other context, then it falls all apart. So if you only depend on the constant pressure of the cameras in all the corners that keep the people in check, you can create a positive effect, yes. But the moment that weakens or is not there, it falls apart. And that is why I argue that in addition to external mechanisms, which I totally agree we need, there should be strategies to allow men, and I was saying allow, because it's really not easy to change that. You cannot just say to a person, well, that's not good. Be different now. That's nonsense, and it has never worked. And this is why the management of this problem is, despite the few successes which there are, but it is still unsolved. And I really challenge everyone who is knowledgeable and a professional in the field to, really look maybe not in the mirror, it's not really about that, but if you really, truly, honestly want to change the actual problem, there is no way around allowing humans to develop in a way that the internal pressures are less, so that the power dynamic of being in control creates less or no arousal anymore. And that is necessary in order to achieve the outcome we're all aiming for. And the great news about that is that this developmental direction of someone's emotional structure in order not to be aroused when being controlling someone. Or it brings me to that sentence, no means no, which is a very important concept, but again, it's not deep enough. It is a concept that comes from, hey, we have to put a limit here. But it's not the ideal state. And it is, again, just an external information. It does not give men or women an actual pathway to really access a way to become that. It doesn't. So let me elaborate. No means no is fine, but even better is only a yes means yes. And there are ways to train men, not educate them, but help them become structured in a way that not hearing a no, for example, from a woman, intimate partner, is not enough to start something. Only an expressed yes will actually be interesting. And here we come back to the whole sex drive thing. Ignoring the sex drive is a huge trap. On the other hand, of course, to say that the sex drive is that uncontrollable force, of course, is silly. In some men it is, and it's a sign of immaturity. With all respect, I don't want to offend nobody, but we have to be very clear here. If you are very controlled by your sex drive, that's not a nice state to be in. It's like you were controlled by your hunger. I mean, I sometimes compare the sex drive with hunger, which is also a drive. It's a drive we all accept as human, something that increases over time. If you haven't eaten for a while, you get hungry. And then there are, in our society, mechanisms that you do not have to harass nobody in order to satisfy the hunger. Take care of it yourself. And in most situations, of course, there are people who are starving, and that is not really helping my metaphor right now. But let's assume a functioning society and context. There you're supposed, if you're an adult, to take care of your hunger yourself. I mean, go to the fridge, buy some food, like take care of that. You have no right to harass nobody to take care of your hunger. And strangely, when it comes to the sex drive, we seem to kind of allow that. Or actually, we don't, but it is happening that the sex drive is being dealt with and handled like that so obscure phenomenon. It's not. It's something that exists. It's evolutionary, incredibly important. I mean, if you consider the risks that humans get into by having intercourse and women getting pregnant, the risk of dying in childbirth with, in all these millennia and hundreds of thousands of years where there was no medical care, and the death rate, I mean, even under like even 200 years ago, and still in many areas of the world where medical care is lacking, there's such a risk of dying. So you have to have a very strong drive to make things happen, right? So there is, it is strong in men and women alike. I mean, this old myth that the sex drive would be weaker in women, I mean, that's another fairy tale. I mean, women are usually, in most societies, they have to suppress the way they express their sex drive, and they learn not to, because then society has has ways to punish them for that. But it's massive, it's there. But that's maybe a tangent. So the point is it is there now. How what do we do with it? Well, a developed, mature human being should not have other people to take care of that unless they really want to. Unless there is one establishes the foundation for that, and that's something that people want to experience and share and also enjoy. But the problem starts when exactly that is not wanted. And in the way society is set up, the problem usually falls more on the side of the men, but not because they have a stronger sex drive, just because they are less trained to suppress it in certain ways than women are. So we do live in a world where probably 80 or 90% of these, the sexual misconduct is conducted by men. But it's still a universal phenomenon, just there are reasons why there is that difference. So then let's focus a bit more on the men for this specific reason. But I would always like to emphasize this is fundamentally a universal phenomenon. It is universally human. So men deserve a pathway to develop the way their sex drive manifests, that's something that is non-destructive to others. And I do think this is mostly lacking. And should be another conversation about the hows and the whys and what is there all lacking that doesn't happen. There are many reasons. But if we look at it from the standpoint of, okay, here we are, that's the cards we have been dealt, now what? Because the other conversation would be, well, how could boys grow up to become men where their arousal and their sex drive only happens in situations which are mature and non-destructive and actually constructive? Because it's fascinating that intimacy and sexuality, well, the sexual part is contained in intimacy. Of course, intimacy is the wider, the larger concept. Intimacy is everything that is close to us, and that does include sexuality, but of course, that's just a small part of intimacy. Be that as it may, how can what I was going to say is that isn't it curious that sexuality can be the most wonderful, fulfilling, transcendent experience on the one end to the most horrific, terrible experience on the other, depending on the circumstances. That is very interesting, I think. So it really very much depends. And of course, that's also tragic, and that shows how important it is if we end up on the one or on the other end of the spectrum or somewhere in the middle, of course. So shouldn't it then be an interesting project for every human being to tap into that quality of life and develop an ability to create intimacy and sexuality that is on that uplifting quality side? So that is also different from just looking at, okay, look at all the damage, we want less of the destructiveness. That's not the strongest motivator. Like, I hate to break it, but I mean, it is a good motive, certainly, to say, hey, I want to be less destructive in the life of others. But is that really the thing you are like, yay, let's be less destructive? Isn't it more about, hey, how can I make that so much richer? How can I do that, discover it, what is right for me, and discover this whole world of wonder? Isn't that a very different value proposition than just, hey, well, don't be destructive? And since these things exclude each other, you cannot, on the one hand, manifest the beauty of that and at the same time be destructive. It doesn't work. And this is why when I talk about gentle masculinity, the value proposition is discover a quality which is so much richer and profound and elevating. And I could find so many more adjectives about what this all is and can be. And then automatically you won't be destructive. Like, it's just a side effect, because that just then becomes so uninteresting. And I would even go one step further. If men are developed in a way that this power dynamic, if there is not a clear yes that is expressed, that is being shown, they are not turned on, then you have achieved it. Because then you don't need the cameras, the external control mechanisms. If the woman doesn't signal, and I'm just staying in the heterosexual example for now, if the woman doesn't clearly signal the interest, there should be a shutdown of, well, then why would I desire that? What's supposed to come out of it? The issue is, again, that when I communicate this idea to men and just say, this is the way to feel, there you go, most men are like, all right, sounds nice, but I experience life differently. And here, I think I am less cynical with men, and I say, I get it. So the path to change and develop requires the application of certain techniques and practices. That will not happen by me just explaining that to you. It won't. It can spark curiosity. It can be like, all right, what's he saying? Okay, there's that possibility, right? So it can open a door, but it's not the same as walking through the door, and it's also not done in a day. That's a process. This is probably, it's a year-long process, but it's possible, and it's probably it always depends on, how far away are you from that state, right? It doesn't have to take years, but it will take a while depending on the person. So the question is, how do we get there quickest? And, well, I have tools and strategies for that. That's the great news. And with that message comes that trying it differently won't work. It just won't. And the proof is all around us. And unfortunately, there are a lot of mechanisms right now in society which work in a different direction. And I do talk about it sometimes when I talk about the whole dynamic of men are told they should be going out there and always push until there's a no. And of course, if there's a power dynamic, there will be no. And then they keep pushing until something happens. And again, the point is to develop into a man who is not aroused by it. And we should avoid the high horse and I don't understand how men can do that and Yeah, I get it, but it doesn't help, It really doesn't help. It doesn't work. So can we just leave that maybe and actually have strategies which are not just focusing on the external pressures to keep people in check? That alone will not be enough. It is necessary because tomorrow not everybody will be a different man or woman, right? Like if we're realistic, it's gonna take a while. So yeah, of course the external mechanisms have to be there. There's no discussion about it. But the actual solution, the beautiful solution, is the strategies to go that path to develop, to change for yourself. And as a side effect, you become less destructive for other people. I mean, that's amazing. That is the proposal that I'm making, and that is what I am offering in this place. So, a part of our time and the time I will spend here will be opening possibilities, explaining concepts. It's necessary. But like anyone else talking to you with concepts, it will change a little. It's a start. It's okay. It's probably even necessary. Because if the direction isn't clear, you cannot make no decision, and you might not ever decide to actually practice the exercises that I propose because you don't know where are we going. So the talking about it has its place, but it cannot be the main part of it all. Most of your time should go into the exercises, which are mostly focused on your own emotional stabilization, which can catalyze certain changes that certain pressures, certain connections of your drives with power dynamics, for example, can change. That's just one example of the possible effects that such exercises can have. There are many other effects they can have, but in our context now, that is a very important one, I believe. So that's the proposal I have. Yeah, rather central and important. It is definitely worth it. And I hope that made sense. And see you next time.